Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, and sport, and anything else we can think of. And this subject we're going to talk about today is kind of on anything else we can think of. It covers all sorts of various subjects in society. I'm delighted to say my guest is going to be talking about AI. His name's Starr. He's had a letter of liberty that he's written about this subject, and we're going to talk about it today. So hello, Sandy.
Hi, Chris.
Oh, cool. Before we get into the subject of AI, because there's quite a lot to discuss, can you just explain for our viewers and listeners who you are and what made you decide to write this letter of liberty?
Yeah, so I work for a charity called the Progress Educational Trust, which is a charity based in the UK that seeks to improve choices for people who are affected by infertility or genetic conditions. And that means that we encourage debate and discussion and understanding about topics including fertility, assisted conception, genetics, genomics, and embryo and stem cell research. AI does come up a little bit in that context. For example, people are now using AI to understand the genomic data better, to study developing embryos, even to come up with ideas for new molecules they might create. But my interest in AI is actually much wider than that. So it actually falls outside the auspices of my job. I wrote this letter on liberty. Oh, I've got a copy. Shameless plug. I wrote it because everyone was, well, I don't know if you've noticed, Chris, everyone seems to have been losing their mind about the subject over the past year. It's suddenly rocketed in prominence. Not that it wasn't prominent before, but there have been a number of recent developments that have brought it right to the forefront. And so I wanted to sort of pause, take a deep breath, make sense of it, and also kind of look back in history a bit, quite a long way back in history, 100, even 200 years, to see if there are any threads that could help us orient ourselves in relation to the questions that are now being posed by the latest developments in AI.
It's interesting. We'll go back to genetics in a minute, but it's interesting you talk about, and it is very well explained, the history of not just AI as such, but just computers in general, from Alan Turing to Ada Lovelace. Can you just explain, with Ada Lovelace, can you just explain in layman's terms for viewers, what was her history behind AI and how did her research help it today?
So it starts with a man called Charles Babbage, who was an English polymath who made important contributions to a number of fields. And he came up with devices that were never entirely built. They were only sort of partially built, or the blueprints were drawn up. They weren't fully realized. One of them was called the difference engine, and it was a sort of mechanical calculator, effectively. But the successor to the difference engine was something called the analytical engine, which was a more general purpose device that was actually more akin to what we might now think of as a computer. And where Ada Lovelace came in is she was a mathematician who was a very important collaborator of his. Her father was the famous or infamous poet Lord Byron, and her mother did not want her to take after Byron, so she wanted to make Ada into a mathematician. But Ada Lovelace quite cleverly blended those two provinces of arts and creativity and of really quite hard science. And she became a very important collaborator with Babbage. The way that the details of this analytical engine, this precursor to the computer, got published is really complicated because Babbage was very reticent about publishing. So what the way it almost defies belief, actually. He gave a talk about the analytical engine in continental Europe that someone then attended and wrote a summary of, that Ada Lovelace then read the summary of and translated back into English. And then presented to Babbage for his approval. And then she decided to add, after her translation, what she called notes from the translator, sorry. And it was in these notes, she was so self-effacing, you couldn't really be more self-effacing than that, saying that you're writing the notes to the translation, to the write-up of the speech of the guy who came up with the idea. But actually, she was far too self-effacing, because in those notes by the translator, she came up with an awful lot of extra ideas that really fleshed out Babbage's ideas. And she even came up with something that's often considered close to the first ever computer program in the pages of those notes.
Oh, okay.
She was a really important thinker. And the reason I'm interested in her in relation to AI is because in those notes, she sort of explores what this device might do and how it might work in future, or other devices like it. And what struck me is, in presenting sort of first one set of ideas about it and then the other, she's almost having the arguments we're having now about AI, or certain types of AI anyway, the generative AI, the stuff that creates words and pictures that we've seen a lot of lately. Because on the one hand, she's saying, oh, it can be used to create, such a device could be used to create this amazing, art. And on the other hand, she's saying that it's not a creator of entirely original ideas. So she's almost having this tussle that we're having now over what exactly this technology can do and how we should think about it. And in fact, one of the large language models in the GPT-3 family of large language models that sits underneath ChatGPT, although it's currently being replaced by GPT-4. Actually, two of those models are named Ada and Babbage in honor of these two.
Yeah, so the influence is very far and wide. And what you said there about Ada Lovelace, her father was Lord Byron, the poet. That's one thing that's always interested me with AI, because I've always seen AI, until probably this year actually, as this almost manufactured way of doing things. So i.e., if you asked it to write an essay about yourself, it'd write an essay and it'd be very factual, but it wouldn't necessarily be any emotive to it, or any particular style of writing, whereas that seems to be changing. AI tend to be, has it taken capture of that emotional aspect now? Is it that advanced?
It's tricky to tell, isn't it? Because how much is coming from the AI and how much is coming from us? So there's a thought experiment I like to do. Alan Turing very famously came up with his own thought experiment in 1950, which we now call the Turing Test, which involves, to put it simply, it involves a human having exchanges with two unseen parties. He knows, or she knows, whichever it is, that one of the parties is another human and one of them is a machine. Each of them is claiming to be a human. Can this interrogator, as they're called, tell which one is which? And in Turing's description, of course, it's written exchanges, it's written words. But nowadays, we could take that experiment a lot further. We can imagine that you and I are having this conversation we're having now in 5 or 10 years' time, and we can think of it in different scenarios. One scenario is we have the conversation in the pub, which would be great if there are still pubs in 5 or 10 years. I hope there are. And in that case, assuming you've, I don't know, not got crazy gadgets in your glasses that are trying to deceive you, then we would have the evidence of our senses to reassure one another that we are humans and so on. But if we were doing it like we're doing now, sort of over Zoom or something in 5 or 10 years' time, you could have really slick technology that actually does a very good job of giving the impression that you're talking to someone when you're not. So if that's the case, if the technology were that far advanced that you couldn't tell just from, I don't know, the way it glitches or something, that you're not talking to an actual person, then the question arises, well, how do you know you're talking to a person, with thoughts and autonomy of their own? And it seems to me there's only really two things ultimately we can use, as I say in the Letter on Liberty. One is our attention, the type of attention we're paying and how good that is. And the other is our judgment, how we judge one another. And, in the hypothetical situation where you or I were doing this in 5 or 10 years and we were successfully deceived, the other person transpired not to be there, it was just a program or what have you, you could read that in one of two ways. I think the way a lot of people would read it was that the machines had passed a test, basically, and perhaps even that they had minds of their own. I think that's highly unlikely. I'd be more inclined to see it as us, you or I, whichever was the human, having failed a test, because we hadn't adequately assessed one another, and perhaps we should have done.
Okay. So going by, what you're describing sounds like that famous scene in Blade Runner, where Deckard is trying to find out if Rachel's a replicant or not, and she actually is. But it's interesting because you talk about attention and judgment. What if you're someone that has a learning disability, and therefore that affects our judgment as a whole? say theory of mind or something like that, or empathy, like empathy, like someone who's autistic, for instance. How does that test take that into account or not?
That's a very good question, actually, because we do rely on a lot of cues in our interactions with one another, which might be missing or different or unconventional with someone who wasn't the regular deck of cards. So you're quite correct. That would have to be taken into account. And there would be, that would be a terrible indictment if we started accusing one another of being machine-like because we were misreading, because we weren't generous enough or open-minded enough in our understanding of what form humanity can take and how people can behave. So I actually think that's a very important caveat or precaution you've just raised there to the sort of argument I'm driving at. Nonetheless, I am inclined to think that we should be able to assess one another's humanity successfully, even taking on board that people come in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah. Now, earlier you said about how people have lost their minds over AI, and I was seeing some memes on social media relating to the Terminator and Skynet, and all sorts of things. Obviously, that's not happening. However, obviously we talk about ChatGPT in current society. How is AI being used, and how has the use of AI been ramped up over the last year, 18 months?
So the type of AI that's really taken off in the last year, it's taken a lot of people by surprise, is what's often called generative AI. It's the type of AI to which you can give a prompt, and it's often a language prompt. It doesn't have to be. And when it's a language prompt, nowadays it can be a natural human language. It doesn't have to be in a special code. And it will give you back pretty quickly some amazing creations, some chunk of text, some image, some piece of code, if you're a programmer and you want it to help you code. And that's really taken off in the last year when ChatGPT, so GPT had been around for a while, but the ChatGPT sort of chatbot version really took off fast. By some measures, it's the fastest growing app in history in terms of the number of people who took it up. So that's taken people aback a bit. It's been in the news in the past week that, Downing Street was not impressed by its official, AI advisors and bodies and organizations it had set up to look at all this because it thought they'd missed the boat on it. They're saying we didn't miss the boat. You just didn't read our stuff well enough. But anyway, whoever's writing all that, it's taken people by surprise. It's taken the authorities in Europe by surprise. There was a piece of legislation called the AI Act, actually, which has been cooking in Europe for a few years now, which didn't have much in it about generative AI, and now they're frantically rewriting it to try and cover that. So that's what's really brought it to people's attention and brought it into everyone's lives and made it more than just a little hobby. Is this generative AI that can create these seemingly unique, bespoke, quite sophisticated things from scratch. And the technology that underpins that generative AI, it's a type of model that's often nowadays they use these broad term foundation models to describe the sorts of tech that can do it. And that's why the UK government has just set up what it's called the Foundation Models Task Force, which to sort of look at all this. And it's kind of comparing it in terms of its importance to the Vaccines Task Force during the COVID pandemic. So the British authorities are really staking quite a lot of importance on this, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah. It just seems so fascinating, and it's interesting. I come from mainly a sports background. I do have an interest in art, but come from a sports background, and obviously over the last 20 years, you've had a lot of technology used in sport. And one of the arguments against some of the technology, against the technology used in sport, is it takes away the power from the referees, from the officials. But then there's others that say that, yes, you've got technology, but you're still going to have a human element behind it. And I'm just wondering, with the way AI is, how much of a human element is there in AI currently, other than the creation of it? And also, will that human element become less and less as the years go on?
It's tricky because the stuff the AI is being trained on, this data, is human. So in a way, it's like a giant remix of our collective selves that's being given back to us in strange and interesting ways. So in one sense, the stuff couldn't be more human because it's made from human stuff. Even though it can take unusual forms that we might not have done by ourselves. but there is a question of how much sort of human judgment goes into it. And I think that's what worries people a bit, because the more sophisticated these models are, the more sort of open-ended and general purpose they are, the more you sort of set them going without a specific objective in mind. And then you don't quite know where you might end up. So I think that's what people are a bit worried about. But there is a sense in which what this AI is giving us is very human. One thing that interests me that I think is underrated is you can use the AI, you know, people often, you give it a prompt and it gives you back the thing that sort of best matches the prompt. You can actually use it to give you something back that worst matches the prompt. You can flip it. And I think that's a lot more interesting because then it gives you something that someone really wouldn't have come up with, or else they might have done the other way around. And there's a fun example called Loab, L-O-A-B, which was, it's this weird, spooky character that someone came up with using generative AI by basically trying to get the AI to create the algorithmic opposite in some weird sense of the actor Marlon Brando. Oh. And it came up with this weird anti-Brando creation that I don't think a human would have come up with. So that sort of thing is really fun.
That's really interesting. That's bizarre.
It is.
Yeah, very bizarre. And actually, you talk about people. Have we kind of been doing that with a lot of humans in general over the last few years? And what I mean by that is you have things like, not to say AI, but Photoshop. You know, got deep fake, which is so good now. I can't tell sometimes the difference unless you see an original image. Isn't there an argument to say that actually we've been kind of going down this road anyway, even without AI, in the sense of trying to use computers to create the perfect image or the perfect whatever it is in society?
Yeah, the images do seem to be getting a bit, you know, increasingly disconnected. I mean, this has happened before. Well, it's weird because it's almost like a reverse. We went from paintings and things like that to photography, which in some ways seems more literally representative of what you're seeing, although there's still a lot of thought and steps that go into it and ways you can create trickery. So, you know, photography can be very deceptive in what it does. But yeah, now the images are getting a lot more fluid again, a lot more likely to have been fiddled with. And it's not fiddled with by some expert in a dark room or special effects house. It's fiddled with by any of us using some filter or some app or what have you. I think it's about to ramp up as well. There's an AI-based image technology called neural radiance fields, which people are getting quite excited about, which is, if it really takes off, it's going to allow us to, like, you know, use a phone and sample the 3D space around us and then sort of mix and match it with other 3D spaces, put imagined things in it, do all sorts of things. And the results are quite photorealistic because it handles lighting in a way that lighting hasn't really been handled using previous type ways of creating images. So yeah, I think images might be about to get a lot more slippery, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, maybe it's a good thing if we get a lot more skeptical about images and also about audio recordings and people's voices. If we don't assume just because it's been captured, you know, don't assume it's automatically that it's real. There are discussions happening at the moment about whether, you know, there could be mandatory watermarking of images and things like that to get around the deepfake problem. I think DeepMind in Britain, which is now owned by Google, is looking at doing that. I don't know if that will work. I'll be very interested to see.
Why wouldn't you be sure whether that would work or not? Would it be a case of people's choice or what?
Well, it's how you can enforce it, I suppose. It's how you can mandate it. It's who has the control or the authority. Watermarking actually in any context, you know, is a tricky thing to enforce. You know, you can create penalties. So if someone's shown to have not watermarked something when they should, or to have removed a watermark or got around a watermark, you can create a penalty, and then that will disincentivize people from doing that. Maybe that's one way to do it. Traditionally, you couldn't use photocopiers to photocopy, you know, banknotes, for example. I'm not saying that's a direct analogy, but some people doubtless did, but there are ways to create penalties and disincentives and hurdles, and perhaps that's what people are going to try to do. But the rest of us who aren't making these rules, I think we could do with getting a bit more skeptical about the images we see and not just assuming that they are what they purport to be.
Yeah, because when you do, as you were saying about the images of people and places, I know this sounds cliche, but it does sound like a Black Mirror episode. And I just wonder, one of the things with social media people talk about is the image images, like people posting like an image of themselves by a beach or a night out, just looking all glamorous, and it has effects, especially against young girls, of like body dysmorphia and so on and so forth. And I just wonder, would you think that if you could fake the images, not just of yourself, but of, say, where you live, that's going to affect people in not just in terms of body dysmorphia, but just in terms of having this pressure of keeping up with the Joneses, both in terms of buying stuff in order to film, but also just having this fake background about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of that in general, isn't there, of people sort of cultivating personas and having to keep it up online on whatever social media platform. And you know, is it worth it?
Yeah.
Maybe we should be going to the pub more instead.
Yeah, indeed. It sounds really bizarre, like you can use that for that images. And I'm just wondering, as you're saying, something like the media, there's a lack of distrust, there's a lack of trust in the media at the moment. And I think if you were to use these images as like part of your photos, saying newspapers or online versions, or even TV news, I just wonder, I take it people's view of the media will be a lot more downhill than it even is today.
Maybe, but I suppose that then, like with all the stuff about AI, that just means we need to up our game. You know, we need to find, if the AI is undermining our unsettling us and undermining the value we place on things or the trust we have in institutions or people, then we have to find a way to put that back, you know, and do things that the AI can't actually do. It sort of it puts the ball back in our court, really.
How good is, and I'm speaking as a writer as well from a literature perspective, how good is AI in regards to writing nuance? And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was on some short literary course, and this woman wrote about this fight she had with in school, like a school playground fight, but she wrote it from the perspective of a child. So she was talking in the language of the slang and the language of a child. I'm just wondering, is AI very good at picking up that slang, and that nuance in conversation that happens between people in a way that other writers basically write down when they're writing books?
I don't know. I imagine there are contexts in which it can do it well and other contexts in which it fails. What it does is it sort of combs through its data and picks up on patterns and connections that we might not ordinarily see, or that we might sort of get at intuitively, and it's seeing things in quite a different way. One of the odd things about AI, and I mentioned this in the letter on liberty, is it comes from this weird mix of predictability and randomness. And actually, some of that dates back to a really interesting Russian mathematician. I have to give his very long-winded name, Andrei Andreevich Markov Sr., because his son had almost the same name and his dad had a similar name. And if you don't spell it out, you get them all mixed up. But this fella, Andrei Andreevich Markov Sr., he invented something in around 1907 called the Markov chain, which is a way of establishing probabilistic connections or dependencies between two or more distinct things, two or more distinct states. And interestingly, when he came up with the idea, it was in the context of a debate about free will, because there were others in the Russian intelligentsia who claimed that these mathematical phenomena in statistics were evidence of human free will. And so he invented Markov chains as a way of demonstrating that that wasn't the case, that you can't prove the existence of free will mathematically, because he showed that you can make numbers or variables conditional on each other, or conditional, sorry, on the one that immediately precedes it in the chain, while still having them technically independent from one another. So cut a long story short, he defeated that argument. What's interesting, apart from the fact this was an argument about free will, and these Markov chains are now really important in AI, they were one of the initial ingredients in technology, is he then went on to use it to study Russian literature. He was doing this by hand because they didn't have electronic computing. He was doing this painstakingly. He looked at the verse novel Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin and created this Markov chain that broke down the likelihood of a consonant being followed by a vowel or a vowel being followed by a consonant in the writing of Pushkin. And what he was doing was a super simple version of what ChatGPT does. If you say to it, write in the style of Pushkin, and except he was doing it, he did that in 1913. And I say all of this because when you were talking before about ChatGPT and other, we could talk about Google's Bard as well and other chatbots, whether they can capture nuance and style. They can do remarkable things, but the way they do it is by blending predictability and randomness in this rather odd way, which can approximate well in some circumstances to what a human might do, but in other respects, I don't think it's the same at all. Mm-hmm. I think we can rest assured that there's something unique and distinct about our creativity, although it's now incumbent on us to prove that. Yeah. It's like, if the machines can do something we can, well, maybe that should be encouragement for us to now do something the machines can't, if you see what I mean, in our writing or whatever field of endeavor we're in.
Oh, cool. So with Markov change, because I'll be honest, until I read Your Letter of Liberty, I'd never heard of them.
Yeah.
So I've done some quick research, and I'm just thinking, with that, correct me if I'm wrong, with Markov change, is it based on the fact that it's based on predictability, but it's based on predictability based on the state we're in now? So it's not based on previous information that we inquire. Is that correct? Have I got
That's sort of correct. So when you've got these multiple links in the chain, and each one is, in a certain sense, dependent only on the immediately preceding link, not the ones before. So in that sense, that's true. It's sort of the memory is wiped clean each time and you start afresh. However, because the state the previous link in the chain is in, the likelihood of that is influenced by the state the previous chains were in. There's a broader sense in which the things are connected. Yeah. So that's what I mean when I say in some sense it's predictable, in another sense it's random. I think the proper way to say it is that the values are independent, conditional upon the one immediately prior to the current one, or some such formulation. The point is, you do this and then you take a step back and look at this chain you've made, and in some ways it behaves predictably. It sort of settles down into fixed values, but in other ways it's not quite predictable. There's still latitude within it to be different. And you've got to remember that thing I mentioned about Markov and Eugene Onegin, you know, that's him using his chains to do what they call two parameters, you know, the vowel to consonant likely probability and the consonant to vowel probability. GPT-3 uses billions of parameters. GPT-4 uses trillions of parameters. So it just ramps up the complexity and apparent sophistication of the end results massively.
Yeah, and obviously I imagine you've got to take into account the rules of the literature depending on the country you're in, and say if you're Japan or China, you have to take into account the symbols that are used as well in those rules. So I imagine the connections between all of those are vast to be correct.
Yeah, and I'm slightly oversimplifying it. I mean, it's moved on a long way now from Markov chains. Like the T in ChatGPT, which stands for transformer, that's a way of using AI that it moves beyond Markov chains. It's another step of sophistication even after that. But that's where it came from. And that idea of predictability and randomness is very interesting. And I should give credit to two other people rather than implying it's all from Markov. Claude Shannon was a really important theorist in the 1940s. They call him the father of information theory. And it was him who really thought that Markov's methods could be used not just to analyze something like Pushkin's poetry, but to create something new that might resemble, in some sense, a natural language. So Shannon, in some ways, we have him to thank for the way that machines can come up with things that are apparently human and sophisticated, especially layers and layers that get more and more as you work up. And then Turing himself, Alan Turing, in his 1950 paper, he says, you know, that it's probably, I think the phrase he uses, it's probably wise to include a random element in a learning machine. He understood that a little bit of randomness goes a long way. If you make these things too perfect, then weirdly they don't come across natural. You have to mix in a bit of error, a bit of grit in the oyster.
Yeah. So is it? I know I think Isaac Newton who talked about standing on the shoulders of giants.
Indeed,
it's similar to that, but it's having a little bit of anarchy along on certain parts on it as well.
Yes, that's true. There's also a whole other thread I've not mentioned, a whole other historical thread, which leads to this, which is more specific to Alan Turing. So yeah, I've mentioned Alan Turing's 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, but it's actually really interesting to look at his 1936 paper. Well, he wrote it in 1936, published in 1937, where he basically laid the basis for modern electronic computing. Without that paper, you and I would not be talking on the gadget we're talking on. You know, it changed the world, that paper. The interesting thing about that paper is he wrote that in the context of trying to find limits to knowledge, actually. That paper was written to, the full title of the paper is On Computable Numbers with an Application to the Entscheidungsproblem, which is German for decision problem. And that was a problem posed by the world's most eminent mathematician in the late 19th, early 20th century, this German mathematician called David Hilbert, who came up with these, he wanted to find foundations for knowledge, basically, in the fields of mathematics and philosophy and logic, but it would have had broad consequences. He wanted to find deep foundations for knowledge. And so he posed a number of problems, well, 3 in particular, to sort of seal the deal. And Alan Turing, and then another guy called Kurt Gödel, found out that these problems could not be resolved in the way Hilbert needed them to be resolved in order for Hilbert's project to have succeeded. And his project was related to other projects at the time, including the work of Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead and various other people. So it's weird. So we kind of got electronic computing out of the fact that a limit to knowledge was found in a weird way.
Yeah.
Hilbert was sort of saying, we need these foundations of knowledge. And Turing and Gödel were sort of like, well, you can't have that, but you can have this. And they gave us computing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, with limits of knowledge, did they take into account, especially obviously in humans, computers is something different, but did they take into account things such as social factors, like how you learn, what knowledge you're born with? And what I mean by that is if you've got, say, mother and father who are both very academic and so on and so forth, was all that taken into account when Turing did his paper, or was it just almost this tabula rasa, like this blank slate?
Well, Turing's there's two things going on. Turing's 1936 paper was looking at a narrow question about what's possible to know. A very deep question, in as much as these people thought that these were some of the deepest questions you could ask, you know, and everything else you might think of sort of sat on top of them. But it was quite a narrow question. And the fact he kind of invented computing in the act of answering it, his genius. So when he wrote the paper, a computer was a person. It was a person who sat in a room and did very dull rote calculations, usually a woman. And he looked at these people and he created this abstract model of what these people were doing, the Turing machine. And his genius was to sort of, to take what these rote exercises these humans were doing and say, how can we take the essence of that, and understand what it is. And in so doing, he created a way to make universal computing machines effectively. Like the Analytical Engine, but he sort of formalized it, machines so that you can run a potentially limitless number of programs on a machine. You and I don't have to plug in something totally different or rewire something if we want to do one thing rather than do the other. So when he then wrote later on his 1950 paper, when he came up with the Turing test, that was him widening his scope. He's like, okay, I've abstracted these computers doing this boring work. Let's think about humans in general. You know, could computers match them in all senses? Now, I think that was too ambitious on his part, but it's wonderfully ambitious. Even though I think it was crazy, I salute the ambition. From his way of thinking, the way he understood humans, I think he did think that all the things you've just mentioned could be understood in fairly mechanical terms or turned into something that would mean that a machine could match a human. Now, I want to say he was wrong, but he says in that paper, at the end of the century, the use of words and general educated opinion will have altered so much that one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. And he was right in a way, because nowadays, if you speak of machines thinking, you're not necessarily going to be contradicted. You know, people speak about it all the time. So in that sense, he was right, as much as predicting the way we would think about our machines. But I think I think it's kind of up to us to prove him wrong in a wider sense and say, actually, no, we shouldn't be able to speak of machines thinking. Humans do think in ways that machines can't.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And funny enough, before we've done this interview, I went to a cafe
Mm-hmm.
because we talked about people upping their game and so on and so forth. And then I went to do some shopping. And what was interesting was the customer service was almost mechanical. Hi, sir. How are you, sir? Can you help, sir? I've been to restaurants where that's happened. Hi, sir. What do you want, sir? And so on and so forth. Do you think, and especially in an age of political correctness where people are almost afraid to say what they want, so almost what they say is almost a lot more predictable than say it was 20 years ago. Do you think one of the problems is now we've almost become manufactured ourselves because of correctness, because of the way the culture's changed, because of customer service, etc. And therefore, you've got this AI human or voice that isn't too dissimilar from like what we do in everyday life now.
You're absolutely correct. Look, it's an old problem that humans are made to act like machines. The other thing that happened in 1936 when Turing was writing that paper is that Charlie Chaplin brought out his film Modern Times, which is about getting, you know, people being in factories effectively feeling like and being treated like cogs in a machine. So it's always been, well, in the history of like industrial society is a history of people being treated like their machines until eventually you can replace them altogether with machines. And that's, you know, that's a problem. We know that's a problem. The interesting thing about this generative AI recently is it's extending that problem to the way we talk and the way we think, not just to things we might do with our hands or solving rote problems like the ones Turing was thinking about. And that's a problem. If the way we communicate with each other and use words can be automated that easily, we're not using words well enough.
Yeah.
And we're all doing it. Each time we use, you know, autocomplete on a text or an email, also now you get these suggestions on emails saying, you know, okay, great, thanks, have a nice day. Each time you do that, it's like you're putting yourself out of business in a way.
Yeah,
You're letting the machine take over. And yeah, what you say about, you know, customer service, anything where it would be nice to talk to a human, it's almost like this generative AI is showing us what we were in danger of becoming. Previously, we were treating each other like machines or happy to talk like machines. Now it's like, bloody hell, we might actually be talking to a machine, literally. It's sort of, I think it's scaring us into thinking again.
Yeah, it's almost like people now are reading from a script.
Indeed.
What the script is going to say beforehand. And so that's my worry is even before AI, we were kind of turning these automatons where if you said something, you're afraid of saying something, so therefore you'd say a predictable answer and so on and so forth. And then AI's come along and it's kind of, like I say, making us think about, oh, it's wrong because what they're doing is wrong because it's not from human being. We're kind of doing it ourselves.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. So the AI is sort of reminding us of that and yeah, throwing the ball back into our court, really. It's not that, you know, if the gap between us and our machines seems to be closing, sure, that might be because the machines are getting better, but it could also be because we're getting worse.
Yeah.
I think people aren't necessarily willing to confront that possibility.
I think the cynic in me would say we're getting worse, more of a latter, absolutely. Right at the beginning, you talked about the charity you worked for and genetics as well. So how is AI being used in that field?
Well, the interesting thing about genetics, this year is the 70th anniversary of the double helix structure of DNA being discovered. And you know, DNA is, in a way, it is digital already. It's nature breaking things down into units and packets of things that can be understood in terms of data. So in that sense, it's, you know, information technology, AI or otherwise, is very well suited to thinking about genetics. And that's why there's a whole field called bioinformatics, which is about using computers to understand genes and genomes better. So obviously AI is now adding to that the sophistication of the way we can interrogate genomic data. AI is also, generative AI even, is also helping us come up with ideas for new synthetic molecules that we can use when we're trying to find ways of changing or doing things to genomes. So that's all an extremely rich field. My one caution, I suppose, is that not everything coming out of it is sensible. Like with any field, there'll be snake oil, there'll be people pushing things that aren't really, you know, what they claim to be, or aren't as good at doing what they claim they are. And in genomics, there's a field, there's a type of genomic data which is very different from traditional genomic data, which is called polygenic scores, which has become possible recently, which people are often claiming too much for. So when you see things being discussed and it involves polygenic scores, my advice is be wary. There are some legitimate uses for those, but they are not the same as traditional genetic tests. And people make claims for them that might not be borne out.
Does AI, and you talked about genetic tests, does AI, could it become more predictive in the future? And what I mean by that is, you heard this thing where you take a blood test and it can decide whether you're more susceptible to various illnesses or conditions in the future. Could AI develop or be used itself as a way of predicting, making things more predictive in terms of you're more likely to catch this or have this develop in the future? And if so, is there a case of, especially if it's from birth and almost a baby, it almost can be a kind of a form of eugenics, like, i.e. if you catch it soon enough that someone might say, oh, I don't want my child being like that, or am I being too skeptical?
You've thrown several different things in the pot there. I'm going to have to separate them out a bit.
Yeah.
So could AI help us look at genomic data and predict things about the future? Yes, it could, but a lot of the time when that claim is being made at the moment, it's using the idea of polygenic scores, which, to illustrate how abstract polygenic scores are, you could make one for any human characteristic whatsoever, regardless of whether it's proven to have a genetic component or not, because it doesn't care. It's a way of taking a vast quantity of data and using it to create some sort of likelihood of something, and it doesn't actually care whether a mechanism has been found to explain whether that's the case or not. So it's happening in quite an abstract field, and it can be very useful, but people are assuming just because it gives you an answer that the answer must be true, and that's not the case with polygenic scores. So, but setting that aside and looking at more conventional sort of genetic and genomic tests, in fact, setting AI aside, because I think what you just asked doesn't necessarily even involve AI. So obviously there's the question of sequencing a whole genome, you know, a complete set of genomic data, all of the DNA in most of the cells of our body, you know, that's only been possible for the last 20 or so years. Actually, it's 20 years ago that the first near complete human genome sequence was created. The Human Genome Project concluded in 2003, and it's only last year that they created that the first one of those with no gaps in it was created. So fine, now you've got this vast quantity of data, 6 billion letters per person. And it's like, what can you look into it and what can you find out? And could there be benefits, you asked, to, well, you need to separate two things. One is looking at the genomes of three things, actually. One is looking at people's genomes before they conceive a child. One is a situation where you're looking at assisted conception, where you sort of create IVF embryos and decide which ones you might want to transfer back to the womb. And then one is when there's somebody born and you sequence the whole genome of a newborn baby to find out if there's anything you should worry about or be aware of in terms of conditions that the baby might have or that person might develop in the future. All of those are completely separate questions, different ethics, different regulation, etc. And the embryo thing is particularly complex, and you're actually very limited in what you're permitted to do there. The newborn thing, yes, there's currently a pilot project in the UK that is exploring whether it might be sensible to routinely sequence the genomes of newborn babies, because at the moment, the number of conditions, every baby born, they do a routine check for certain rare conditions, but the number of conditions they look for is relatively few. And in the UK, it's really relatively few. It's fewer than in most other countries. So they are looking at, if you were to sequence the whole genome of every newborn babies routinely, if you were to offer each parent the chance for that, you wouldn't force it on them. If you were to offer them the chance, would that let you catch a number of, a larger number of rare conditions early and improve the lives of people who might otherwise have debilitating conditions if they weren't treated early? And, they think the answer to that question is yes. And that's why they're doing a pilot project at the moment to investigate it. It's being led by Genomics England, and it's called Newborn Genomes. But they're only going to give back results on a limited list of conditions. They're only going to look for a certain number of things. Just as you've got the whole genome doesn't mean you can or should or must look for absolutely everything you could. They're going to have a specific list of things to look for. And if they find those things, then they're going to sort of report back. So it's happening in a very careful, regulated way, but it does still need a lot of public debate.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just wondering, could it almost make people too safe? So say from birth, you're saying, oh, you've got this condition, so therefore you won't do certain things for that condition. Whereas as human beings, one of the things that helps us to grow is risk. The fact that we'll take risk at a particular age, say, to walk to shops by ourselves when we're 9 or 10 and develop that independence, cars and stuff and so on and so forth, driving for the first time, it's risk that enables us to do that. So is there a case that actually, if you find out things about yourself, certain conditions, certain illnesses that you're more susceptible to as you grow older, you might actually think, I'm not going to do that because if I do, I might develop this. Whereas people's risk, which at the moment we seem to be very risk averse anyway as a society, is there an issue that actually can make it worse because you've almost think that what you discover is destiny?
I mean, those sorts of considerations are part of the decisions that are being made about what the list of conditions is they're going to report back on. In the case of the newborn genomes, I mean, in general, in genetic and genomic tests, there are certain genetic variants that may or may not predispose you to a condition or a problem. Depending on the specifics, they're subject to different regulation and different ethical considerations. So, tests early on, testing anyone in childhood rather than in adulthood, there's a massively higher threshold of sort of ethical considerations that are applied there. Looking at something in childhood that might only be late onset, that might only manifest later in life, even more restrictions on that, because at the moment people are worried about precisely the sort of thing you say. And there's even the concept of a right to an open future, that people shouldn't, unless they're adult and they really want to, and even then you have to think carefully about it, shouldn't be living with effectively the sword of Damocles over their head, wondering if it's going to fall on them. Now, the sorts of conditions they're looking for in newborn genomes don't raise those sorts of problems. Again, the polygenic scores world, which is less regulated, they might say all sorts of crazy things. At the moment you can get an ancestry test from 23andMe or whatever, and it'll say all sorts of things about you, about your ancestry and where you come from. And people get these tests and they go, oh, I always wondered why I had a yearning for the sea. It's because I'm from this part of the world. Most of that is nonsense. And if they start doing stuff of that quality, supposedly about what's going to happen to you in the future, or what kind of person you are, or how good you're going to be at stuff, that's not going to be good. I agree with you. But I think, you can try and regulate these things, but it's not just that, is it? We've got to persuade people just not to think that way about themselves.
Yeah.
It's, in conversations like this, that's ultimately how we've got to do it, not just by regulating who's allowed to do what. People are going to seek out illicit, things if they've got the money and not enough sense.
Yeah, it's again going back to upping our game is one realization of AI that helps us as humans is, yes, we strive to be perfect, but not all of that. The vast majority of us aren't, and actually we shouldn't try to be, and that we should, to a certain degree, celebrate some imperfections. Whereas I think AI is almost doing the opposite somewhat, where we're trying to make us too perfect or our work too perfect.
Yeah, to a point, although remember what I said about if AI is too, they deliberately throw in a bit of randomness and muck because they found that otherwise it's not convincing. AI is sort of calculatedly imperfect, which is creepy.
Yeah, very creepy indeed.
Which is not to say we might not find great uses for it, but yeah.
Oh yeah, I could see great uses for it, certainly in terms of health and crime and so on and so forth, but there's also nefarious means for it. So I'll just give a couple of examples I found quickly randomly. This was on a BBC News website. There was a lawyer who had to write a filing for a case they were working on, and basically they used chat GDP to do this. And one of the things I had to do was quote actual cases to go along with this. And so they put in chat GDP, and he found that instead of actually finding actual cases that are similar to what they're working on, what the chat GDP did was actually make up both the actual past case, the reference case, and actually where it came from. And then there was another one where a professor was looking at other professors studying like the Me Too movement and looking at other professors who had been as a result. And I found one professor who apparently had taken some students to Alaska and actually done that sort of thing. And it was from a basic article from Washington Post. However, it turned out that the article from the Washington Post was actually faked, and hadn't done anything like that. And I'm just wondering, is there, as much as AI can do some good things, is there like a fail safe, as in, and I don't know if it's another computer system or what, or people trained, where people could look at it as actually this is a bit suspicious of AI. There must be something wrong with the system.
Look, they're already trying to put things called guardrails on AI. So OpenAI, the people who make ChatGPT, when they released the GPT-4 sort of iteration of their large language models, they published an interesting document which they called the system card. You can Google it. And what they do with these models is they do put guardrails on to stop them doing things they consider really problematic. So in that system card document, they deliberately ask the GPT to do the worst things, to give advice on the most dangerous and destructive things, to tell people how to kill or injure, themselves or other people. And then they put guardrails on, and they give examples of what it said before the guardrails were added and what it said afterwards. So there is that kind of thought goes into it, rightly or wrongly. You can disagree with their decisions or their methodology. You can think about who should impose these guardrails. Should companies be coming up with it on their own? Should it be done through law? Should some countries do it? And there's all those questions. So that's going on. The thing you talked about is interesting though, because the term they use for it is hallucination. Okay. That's become the term of for an AI. It's basically when the AI asserts something badly wrong with confidence that seems to be at odds with its training data. And they call this hallucination, and this bothers me a bit because it's one of many words that imply that the thing is human. A hallucination is something humans have when they can't distinguish, imagining from reality. To use that term as shorthand for what these AIs are doing, I think encourages us to treat them as more human than they are. It's possibly the wrong term. Then again, we have talked about computers having memory since the 1940s. So arguably we already put foot wrong,
Yeah, hallucination does seem odd.
It's a weird term. They use the term throughout this system card document about how they're trying to reduce the hallucinations and so on. It's bizarre.
Yeah, because hallucinations, as you say, it's something like where you can't distinguish between reality, whereas what you're describing is more just a fault of the system as opposed to
and they use it to describe situations where it's asserting something really confidently and it's just wrong. When they say that it seems to go against its training data, the problem is it's the strength and the weakness of these things is that they Yes, they go off their training data, and there's a lot of human input as well, and sort of processes that try and then refine what it's doing, so it's not completely out of control. But to some extent, it has to be an open-ended process. And that's kind of the point of these foundation models in this generative AI, is that that's why it can do all these amazing things, is because you can't perfectly predict what it's going to do. So guess what? The downside of that is it's going to do crazy things sometimes.
Yeah.
Called hallucinations.
Yeah, it's a crazy term. Personally, I don't agree with it. I think it makes things actually too simplistic, where it's something a little bit more complicated, for sure.
I agree.
You've kind of touched on this a little bit, because we're coming towards the end, in terms of some possible legal avenues. And one of the things with technology, not just AI, but in general, is that the law takes a while to catch up. Not just in the UK, but have you heard anything like from the States or the EU in terms of any laws in place that will regulate AI, and what are they, and what?
Yeah, there are various EU laws. There's one that comes into force next year that will have some consequences for AI, because it imposes something called algorithmic transparency, although that's not quite what it sounds like. It's not going to force people to give up their proprietary algorithms, but it is going to supposedly compel people to give lay-friendly explanations of how their technology works. There's this thing I've mentioned called the AI Act, which has been developing in Europe for some years, but is now being hastily rewritten and debated over, so that it covers this generative AI. And there's tussles going on because over how extensive it should be and how inhibiting it should be. There's something weird going on in Britain at the moment, which is that the online safety bill, I think it's called, I think it started out as online harms and it was renamed online safety, which is being furiously debated in Parliament at the moment. The current iteration of that bill, which may change, I hope it does, before it becomes an act of Parliament. It would be nice if it didn't actually become an act of Parliament, but setting that aside, almost compels people to use AI. It's sort of if I read it correctly, it's sort of saying, you must build certain things into client-side devices that look at their communications and use AI to tell whether they're doing anything dodgy. It's sort of trying to use AI to enforce the law.
Yeah.
And I don't think the technology is in a place where it's sensible to try to do that.
Yeah, I mean, online safety bill, I'm trying to get someone to speak about that, but apparently I think it only applies to certain things it doesn't apply to. So I think if you're like a newspaper and you've got online edition, I don't think it applies there. It doesn't apply to like a foreign body either, I think.
Well, it's still being debated. It's changed a lot and it may still change. It's still being debated in Parliament, that bill.
Yeah, and it's fierce, and I'm trying to get my head around it, but it doesn't sound good at all. Not at all.
Well, there was a really interesting open letter, I think just last week, from a bunch of cryptography experts pointing out some serious shortcomings with it. It might be worth getting one of them on your podcast.
Yeah. I'm working on it. I'm working on getting someone on, absolutely, to talk about it. And I'm just wondering, as with all technology and the law, isn't one of the problems that, because AI just exploded over the last year to 18 months. So is it a case of how you can put a law in now, and then you probably have to put like a sunset clause in it to look at it like, say, even 5 years later might be too late, what, every 2 years? Because that would just be farcical.
Yeah, we get this in my work in fast-moving areas of science. People are always saying, how do we make the law, effectively future-proof? And there's no perfect way of doing it. It's a way of making it, you write it in a certain way so that it can anticipate certain developments to the extent that they can be anticipated. It's never perfect, but it's going to have to be revisited at certain points. The question in the UK, though, is how do laws get revisited? Because there's different ways laws can be passed here, and not all of them have as much input and sort of democratic accountability behind them as others. So I think that's worth looking at. If you're going to have laws that are responsive to developments, it's, what are the mechanisms whereby the revisions or the, amendments come in? That's well worth looking at.
Oh, cool. We're basically at the end of the interview, and I'd like to end on a positive note. So how would you like to see AI developed in the next 5 years? Not how you think it will be, but how would you like it to be developed over the next 5 years?
I want to see I want to see AI being put to inventive use. It doesn't have to be constrained by our everyday life. Let it do the things it's good at that we can't do. Let it create crazy imaginary worlds, you know. Let it find the opposite of Marlon Brando or what have you. Do crazy things with it, but whilst doing all of that, let's all of us try to be a bit less machine-like, try to talk and act in ways that machines can't actually do, and prove that we do still deserve to be regarded as somewhat different from machines.
Oh, cool. And on that positive note, we'll end it there. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been an education for me as well, because there's many things from both this interview and the Letter of Liberty that I've learned about AI, which I didn't know before. So thank you for coming on. All right. If people want to see more information about the charity you work for, where could they go to?
So they can go to Progress Educational Trust, which is progress.org.uk.
Oh, cool. And I'll leave a link to that website in the description below.
Fantastic. Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, sure.
I want to put a word in for the artist who does the covers of Letters on Liberty, Jan Bowman. She's brilliant. Yeah. I love this silhouette picture. You don't know if the human, you know, are they tentative? Are they tender? Are they saying, no, don't come anywhere closer to me, to the sort of robot being? Jan Bowman is brilliant. So check out her website as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've read a lot of Letters of Liberties. I've got one coming out myself, and I'm really curious to see how the artwork is going to be for that. So I completely agree with her about there. So big up to her. But again, thank you so much for the interview. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me. Great talking to you, Chris.
Take care.
Mind how you go.